Hello and welcome to Nature Knowledge. This is a speaker series with experts sharing scientific knowledge on current issues affecting nature in Florida. I'm your host, Dr. Shelly Johnson, State Specialized Agent in Natural Resources with University of Florida IFAS Extension. Thanks for joining us today.
Okay, so we're going to jump in to exploring the world of microplastics, and it seems like from some of the questions that you guys submitted when you registered, which thank you for submitting those. I did take a look at them, and thank you, Shelly, for sharing. That some of you might be like more well-versed in microplastics than others, and it's a huge topic. So even I myself do not know everything there is to know about microplastics, but I'm hoping to give you a good overview, introduction, and hopefully answer some of your questions throughout my presentation, like that you had asked ahead of time. I'm going to address some of those, but also, we'll save time at the end as well. So with that, I know that Shelly already introduced me a little bit, but just a little bit more of my background. So I'm a graduate of the University of Florida. I did my undergrad and master's there in natural resource conservation and forestry with a focus on environmental education and communication. And I'm also a graduate of the Florida Natural Resources Leadership Institute, which if anyone ever gets the chance or is in a field where that title alone might pique your interest, I'm happy to talk to you and could not highly recommend this program. Like it was amazing, honestly life-changing. So awesome program that I just wanted to quickly mention. So we are going to, again, explore microplastics. I do like to keep it somewhat interactive because I know it's hard to stay tuned in on a virtual learning platform. So keep your chat box handy, if you will, and I'll kind of be asking questions throughout. I'll have it open on my screen. And I'm going to just go ahead and start off with a question. We'll see how quick you are to respond, so get ready. But who can tell me what is a microplastic? To the more like if you were to define microplastics, what would that be? So I'll give everyone a second to kind of type in an answer. There's a lot of you on here, so I won't have time to hear from everybody, but small particles in the air, plastics below a certain size. Ooh, I saw somebody had the exact precise amount. Yes, there's answers rolling in. So yeah, I mean, the title alone, right? Very small pieces of plastic, which is amazing. It takes some people longer to get there when I teach to certain groups, but in the scientific field, generally speaking, we say 5 millimeters in size or smaller. So for reference, because I know millimeters isn't like the world that we live in here, it's about the size of a pencil eraser or smaller. So visible to the eye when they're on the larger size. Now within the scientific community, there's debate because we're calling them microplastics, which would imply you need like a microscope or something to see them. You couldn't see them with the naked eye. So some go down to like much smaller levels, which we're not going to get into that today, but some scientists have a little bit higher standards for this definition. But we're going to go with 5 millimeters in size or smaller for the purposes of this presentation. And generally speaking, when we talk about microplastics, because it is such a big topic, the way that we break them down is to classify them as primary microplastics and secondary microplastics. So we're going to start off looking at the primary microplastics. So what you see on your screen here is a primary microplastic. These are something we call nurdles. This is like your fun word of the day if you weren't already familiar. These are the raw resin pellets that are used and shipped all around the world and then melted down and molded into the various plastic products that we see and use every day. You can see they come in different colors, slightly different shapes. One potential source of microplastic pollution is this raw form nurdles because they are being shipped all over the world. We know that spills happen. And I won't dive any deeper into that. But they can also sometimes not be melted down and they're used in various stuffing. This is one example, which is a Beanie Baby. And this is a fun if you want to call it fun, fun activity that we do with kids is dissecting mini Beanie Babies. So this particular one had 371 nurdles inside. And that's, that's only looking at the nurdles, not all the other synthetic material that you see there on the screen, which we will talk about that later on in the presentation. Now, another thing probably a lot of people don't think about is we can often point to something and say, that's plastic. Easy enough, but what we don't often think about is like what type of plastic that is. So on the top half of your screen are different types of plastic in their nurdle form, if you want to stick with the term nurdle. So we have polypropylene, polystyrene, PS just is short for polystyrene. So polystyrene foam beads, PVC, we're all probably familiar with PVC pipes, polyethylene, and nylon. So these are just some, this is not an exhaustive list. Below, on this bottom half of your screen, is those same nurdles placed inside vials of tap water. And the point that we're trying to highlight here is you will notice, if you look closely, some of these nurdles are buoyant and float at the top of the vial. I try to like put the words, I guess I could have highlighted it a little bit better, but some, like the polystyrene and the nylon, are more dense plastics and they sink to the bottom. The words on there are just the different products that these are used for, but this is important to consider in the world of microplastic pollution and where we often think about where microplastics are found. So this is kind of a good visual representation of that. Again, highlighting the different types of plastics and where they might be found. This is now in a saltwater environment, which we know seawater has different density than tap water. We won't get into those details either, but you can see certain products like bottle caps, plastic bags, things like buoys tend to be more buoyant and float. There's other that kind of are in between. They're a little bit more buoyant. All sorts of different plastic containers, fishing nets, cigarette filters, which is by far the #1 probably pollution item that we collect in cleanups, especially the International Coastal Cleanup, which I will mention towards the end. And then things like plastic film, textiles, and our drink bottle containers tend to be more dense plastics that will sink. Plastic film is just, if you think of it, literally like pretty much any product you purchase at the store has some type of plastic packaging that is wrapped in. That's what we're referring to as the plastic film. This is not like, if you see this, this is always how it's going to be, because we know that things can latch onto these products and there's different things that can affect their density over time. So this is just like a generalization. Also, on the topic of primary microplastics is something we call microbeads, which you might be familiar with. Microbeads are typically when these small nurdles are placed inside our personal care products. We changed their name from microplastic to a microbead. And they're used for cleansing and exfoliating purposes. But once people became aware that we were putting plastic in our personal care products, they were not very happy. So when we kind of launched our Microplastic Awareness project, which is part of this outreach effort that I'm doing today, every September we used to do Microplastic Awareness Month. We made fun little memes. So this is one just highlighting deodorant, which is a loophole. We'll talk more about this in a second, but there's tons of different plastics within our products. Obviously, our products themselves are likely plastic, the containers, but they're also sometimes hidden inside of our products. So how do you know if your personal care product contains microbeads? You get to do a fun word search. On your personal care products, maybe you do this often, maybe you don't, but they do have an ingredients list. So if you're into like reading the nutrition label on your food products, you can do the same thing with your personal care products. So hone in, read through the ingredients list. You might have a panic attack because you're not going to know what 90% of those things are. That could be a whole nature knowledge series in itself. But the word you want to look for is polyethylene. You remember that from one of the vials that I showed you before. So that's a type of plastic, the common one that is used for microbeads. And I just did, a quick online search and just took a screenshot of what is polyethylene in my personal care product. And this is the definition: a tough, light, flexible synthetic resin made by polymerizing ethylene, chiefly used for plastic bags, food containers, and other packaging. So if you're like the rest of America, you're probably like, well, why? Why is that in my personal care product? And that's what led to this, which is the Microbead Free Waters Act of 2015. This was a very quick piece of legislation to pass right at the end of Obama's presidency, and it phased out manufacturers and companies from putting microbeads in their products and eventually banning the sale of these products. Now, as with every legislation, there's always loopholes to it. This only applied to products used for cleansing or exfoliating purposes. So things like makeup, deodorant are kind of in the gray area. It did specifically include toothpaste, which was a major contributor to the microbead pollution issue. So again, this was in phases. 2019 was like the latest date. And that was for products that were also like considered a prescription product. So at this point, a true microbead, as defined in this legislation, should not be found in any personal care products on store shelves in the United States. So in our case, it was mostly by 2017 for non-prescription products that this act should have been in effect. So I had this facial exfoliating product pre-act, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to the store and see if this is really true. And I found the exact same product. You can see it there on your screen. And it said right on the back, I flipped it over, read all the ingredients, and I was like, I don't see polyethylene anymore. And it even says right on there, it does not contain plastic microbeads. And I was like, holy cow, this is so cool. So, like all excited, we have a national working group. It's like, hey guys, look, I just found this, like, it's cool, it's happening. And of course, like bubble burst. One of the scientists in the group, they kind of passed it through the chain. And I know this is a long quote, but basically, she pointed out that one of the other ingredients listed in there is another type of plastic, just a different form of plastic. So again, another loophole is that can still be plastics in our products that are not defined as a microbead. That being said, this is a pretty rare case. It just happened to be what I picked. Most companies are completely eliminating plastic from being put inside their personal care products. So it's all good. I know that kind of like might have sounded bad, but that act was hugely, hugely impactful in terms of sources of primary microplastic pollution. Now, we're going to shift to some other sources of microplastics. And don't panic. I promise I'm going to end on like a glimmer of hope. So also in 2017, I was at a conference on emerging contaminants, and one of the researchers was saying they were finding a lot of small black pieces of microplastics in their samples that they hadn't yet been able to like clearly identify. You can imagine a microscopic piece of plastic. To figure out what type of plastic it is takes very, very expensive equipment. And then to be like, that is from this product is that much more challenging. It's not as easy as we think. Fast forward a few years, that's now been found commonly among the research community, and it has now been linked back to tires as being the #1 source of microplastic pollution. Right, we all have to get new tires for a reason. There's wear and tear. It's made of synthetic material. That's not something we can really do a whole lot about unless, there's public transportation options, which could help, and if you can ride your bike, so on and so forth. What I'm going to focus in on is these synthetic textiles, because this is where we can have a real impact. I'm going to do that in a minute, but I'm just going to talk about some of the other sources. So all sorts of different synthetic materials, whether it's clothing, carpets. I mean, textiles is a huge industry in itself. Road markings is another major source. We're very grateful. Again, another thing we're grateful for, keeping people in their lane. But it's paint. Paint is synthetic, and the actual material if you've ever seen it, actually in our parking lot right here, like there's chunks of the road marking coming off. That is another significant source of microplastic pollution. Marine coatings on boats. So they're going through, oceans, lots of turbidity, turbid waters is more what I'm trying to refer to. The paint can chip off. That really goes for any paint on your house. Things need to be repainted, but when that paint's chipping off, it's likely going in the ocean. So that's a big contributor. Construction is another big one. We have a lot of what we'd call best management practices in place to prevent sediments from leaving construction sites, but in that process, we do use a lot of plastic as well. And then we know there's a lot of trash in our ocean. I'll have a statistic on that in a minute. But all of these products that we find on our journey, when we're out and about anywhere in the environment, this just happens to be a beach. This is where I throw in a pop quiz, and I'll give an air high five to anyone who can tell me what this is. A 3D print. So that would be above, yeah, trophy. It's very likely a 3D print. That is not my area of expertise, but I can tell you that that is a soccer trophy. Yes, which is likely also coated in some type of paint. So I don't know, maybe they didn't win first place. I don't know what the story behind this is, but eventually these products, trophy or not, straws, bottles, these are all, this was like in a very short span on the beach. Once these products break down through whether it's sunlight degradation, chemical degradation, wave action, to that 5 millimeters in size or smaller, is when we would classify them as a secondary microplastic. Now, it really honestly does not matter if you're like, oh, that's a primary or that's a secondary. This is just to kind of help you differentiate. Either way, they're all microplastics. Okay, and this is where I said I'm going to focus in on the synthetic materials. So I'm going to break some people's hearts, but it's all out of love for the environment. So a lot of the things that we love, especially here in Florida, we're getting into the heat of summer. I'm already like, I'm not ready. But we love all the quick dry stuff, right? For obvious reasons. Perhaps in the winter, you have your favorite fleece jacket like I did. You have your soft microfiber sheets at home. Well, all of these products, again, if you look on the ingredients label, if you will tell you that they are made of plastic material. In this case, this is from a shirt. It tells me right there, it's 100% polyester. Now you might be like, okay, so what? Well, hopefully you do laundry every now and then. I don't need to know the frequency, but when you do laundry, we put our clothes in the washing machine, top loader, front loader, doesn't matter. And we add our detergent, we do it, it does its business, the water drains. And here comes your next question in the chat. Where does that water go when it leaves your washing machine? The ocean, yes. Good job, Shirley. Yes, too, and it does depend if you have a septic tank. There's different scenarios, but generally speaking, it will go to a wastewater treatment facility. And then, yes, eventually to the ocean in most cases. So this is kind of the flow. We have our synthetic materials that we all love. We wash them, hopefully. It gets sent to a wastewater treatment facility. A ton of research has been done looking at the water at wastewater treatment facilities for the presence of microplastics. They often call them a major source of microplastics, which I personally hate that terminology because we are the source sending our water to them. And this is just one statistic from one study that 83 to 95% of microplastics are removed in the wastewater treatment plant as sludge, so kind of the solids of the wastewater. So any water that leaves your home, if you're not on septic, will go to a wastewater treatment facility. So that's great, that's exciting. I've seen all different percentages, but in general, they're very high. Now, the sludge material is typically either burned or incinerated, which would get rid of the plastics, Or like in my county, our main wastewater treatment facility converts it into fertilizer, which is then sold and kind of help to offset costs of running the wastewater treatment facility. So it's essentially like taking them and just putting the plastics back out onto the landscape. I actually just saw a new study published out of Europe that was looking at this, analyzing how much microplastics is in this fertilizer that we are using from sludge material. And that study said it made up about 1%, microplastics made up about 1% of the weight of the fertilizer, which is pretty significant when you're talking microscopic pieces of plastic. Now, as a result, there are lots of studies looking at impacts to soils, microbial activity in the soil, plant tissue, so on and so forth. The struggle is and continues to be with microplastics research. A lot of it is done either through modeling or in a lab setting, which isn't always, we can't really say that that's what's happening out in the real world. So there are concerns around impacts to soil pH, microbial activity, plant tissue biomass. So there are concerns and there are studies looking at that. There's not really anything that's like really been broadcast as like well-known, and lots of studies to say this is the impact of microplastics on X, but it is being looked at. Okay, continuing down. Then whatever water makes it through the whole treatment process gets dumped as what we call treated effluent. And we go back to this percentage, 83 to 95%. So not all of the microplastics are removed in the process. They're then dumped out. It's not part of a wastewater treatment plant facility's job to do anything with microplastics. This just happens to be the removal process with microplastics. It's dumped back into the environment, and now numerous studies have been done looking at and collecting water samples, determining the presence or absence of microplastics. So this is one example of something that we might see under a microscope. And then we have to say, okay, is this a plastic fiber? Is this a piece of algae? Or is this some type of organic material? We might all have all cotton clothing, and they also shed fibers. So again, it takes very, very expensive equipment to kind of really fully analyze and conclude, yes, this is plastic. And then even more advanced technology to say this is the type of plastic that it is. So why should we care? I probably don't have to tell you this because you're already here, but I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. And I could show you all sorts of different graphs about plastic waste management or plastic production. Either one is going to show you a curve that looks something like this, which just highlights and emphasizes that plastic production and our use of plastics has grown at an alarming rate over the past several years. And I don't need to say really, but with COVID, I cannot imagine that this is going to help this projection. I have yet to find a graph with updated data with COVID years included. There perhaps is a reason for that, but I think we can all safely assume there would be a big spike. I also like to point out, if you see this one starts in 1960. So plastics weren't even really a thing until after World War II. That's kind of when they started to take off. So I always stress and emphasize when people are like, oh, I don't know how we did it. We did it. At some point, we lived without plastic. I know it's hard to imagine. I know it's hard to believe. If you have relatives that are still alive from that time period, please talk to them and help spread the word about whatever they used to do and see if we can bring it back. That's my challenge to you guys. Now, in terms of how much plastic is entering the ocean, there's been a lot of studies that have looked at this. Probably the most cited study is one by Jenna Jambak. She kind of did an estimate looking at like low, middle, and high estimates of the amount of trash that enters our oceans every year. What she equated it to make it more, it was 8 million metric tons, which was like, okay, that sounds like a lot, but we have no idea what that means. So she equated it to 5 standard garbage bags full of trash. So if you were to like stack 5 tall, For every foot of shoreline in 192 countries, which is like all but a few in the world, that is how much trash is estimated to enter our oceans every year. When we just look at microbeads, there was a study that estimated 8 trillion were estimated to enter our waters daily. Now, again, we're talking very, very tiny. The first one is just talking about plastic, excuse me, plastic overall, and this one is just looking at microbeads, which they equated was enough to cover 300 tennis courts, which is crazy. But we had the Microbead Free Waters Act. That study was done in 2015 before the act. So I would imagine this number is significantly less now. Then I alluded to this before, but every year there's a big international coastal cleanup where people enter in the data of what items were collected. Again, I mentioned cigarette butts are pretty much always number one, but in 2017, it was the first year, they always put out like this little infographic, excuse me, of the top 10 items collected. And 2017 was the first year that all 10 items were plastic. And since microplastics started being studied, the first study I remember being published was looking at table salt, and that we found microplastics in table salt, and people were in full panic. And these studies have just exploded. I mean, there's really no way, unless that was your full-time job, and even then, to keep up with the amount of research that's going into this field. It's been found in beer, bottled water, tap water, inside living organisms, including us. So the issue or concern, or both, is we know that there are toxins in the ocean from past activities, current activities. Think DDT. The Clean Water Act was only passed in 1972. Before then, we were basically dumping our wastewater like directly into the ocean. There's lots of activities and chemicals that are out there existing. We know there's plastic in the ocean. What we are now finding, thanks to research, is that these toxins and chemicals really have a preference for plastic particles. They tend to absorb to these particles at a significantly higher rate than other, like more organic material. We know also that animals eat these plastics, whether they're microplastics or slightly larger. In terms of microplastics, one of the like meta studies that I looked at, looking at like the metadata, all the data, it had 172 taxa that have been documented to ingest microplastics. So some are filter feeders, they don't have a choice. They're just sucking in whatever's in the water, and there may or may not be plastics in it. Some are actually eating it intentionally. So we know that's happening. And we also know, we've seen studies looking at whale blubber, the urine of dolphins, that these toxins are then exiting or being retained within these animals. Now, what we have yet to see, at least I have yet to see, any studies to say this species or this particular animal died as a direct correlation of ingestion of microplastics, at least like in a natural setting. There's lab studies and things like that. So this is kind of like where the research again is heading. Macroplastics are again a different thing. We know that animals have died from ingestion of macroplastics, but in terms of microplastics, we're concerned on many levels on the toxins and the impacts those toxins can have on the organisms, and of course, like if that's ultimately going to cause death of the animal. And then getting back to the original question, if you arrived on time when we started, I forget the exact question, but I think Shelly was asking when a plastic bag, how long it takes for a plastic bag to fully decompose. So, and she answered it, which is, right, we're now finding out never. We see all of these infographics out there that say, you know, monofilament fishing line takes 400 years to decompose or disintegrate or whatever term we're going to use. But remember, plastics haven't even been around for 100 years. So it's based on modeling. We now have, and you know, that was the best available data we had at the time. We now know that they don't break down, they break up into smaller and smaller pieces to the point there's a category called nanoplastics, capable of like, we're talking cellular level, tiny, small, like going through the bloodstream. So yes, it will break down, but into very, very, very small pieces. And then we've had all sorts of different companies and efforts try and come up with like ways to get rid of microplastics that are in the ocean. But they're very small. We're talking microscopic pieces of plastic. We saw before they're distributed throughout the water column, and it's not stagnant water. It's moving, there's currents, there's wave action. And the most concern is how could you possibly remove plastics without removing the exact same size microscopic organisms? So we stress, let's stop it at the source. And if you have not heard, there is a big movement, a plastics treaty, if you will. I don't know, there's kind of been different terminology thrown around, but the United Nations had a meeting, and there's basically many, many countries on board to have a huge focus and effort on reducing plastic production, plastic pollution. The agreement is set to be finalized at the end of 2024. So we will see what happens between now and then, but it seems like there's at least a commitment to make this agreement happen. And there's some of the bigger industries and corporations that are also involved with this effort. So, right, we like to always be like, well, you know, I can only do so much as an individual. Why aren't corporate and industry and, you know, kind of more of a top-down approach? So this is now happening. So yay. But I don't want that to stop you from doing things as an individual, because you can make a difference as an individual. I'm just checking in on the time. Okay, so we've heard reduce, reuse, recycle forever. Probably the fourth R that is most relevant with plastics is refuse. We can refuse to use plastic products, especially one-use plastics. It just doesn't make sense. You can also check your personal care products. Remember, do your little word search on your ingredients list and stop purchasing products that might contain plastic, or reach out to the company, use your voice, and let them know that you're not happy about it, especially the ones that might fall into that loophole category. Then any type of cleanup we can do, like stopping it from the source is obviously ideal, but anything we can do to get the plastics before they become microplastics and are essentially impossible to remove from the environment is going to be beneficial. So beach cleanups, or just, you know, whether it's an organized one or just something that you do as an individual, is going to be helpful. And there's lots of things. These are all, again, different memes from our Microplastic Awareness Month, but this gets to the reuse idea. So, you know, in terms of what container you're drinking out of, are you using one that's like one-time plastic, one and done, or is it something you can reuse over and over and over again? I'm assuming most of you are in some organization group, whether it's at work or your volunteer community, where you have meetings. And are you leading by example? If your organization still has styrofoam cups out when you have coffee, you could say, hey, I'm gonna go to the thrift store and buy some mugs that we can all just reuse. So there's little things that we can do. Straws is one. There's reusable straws. You can just refuse a straw altogether. I know there in some cases are medical necessities where straws are required. That's an exception. But again, there are alternatives to plastic if that is the case. Reusable bags, I feel like that was kind of one of the easier adoptions that I saw. Kind of one of the early things that people did is started to bring their own reusable bags. My challenge to you, if you're like, oh yeah, I already do that, is my question would be, do you do that when you also go like regular shopping, not just grocery shopping, but if you're going to go to the mall and get clothes? I have one that like folds up really small that I always keep in my bag. So even if I'm like, oh dang, I forgot it, I'm like, oh wait, I have this one. So that could be something your kind of like next step. Then I cannot stress the power of your voice. You might say, I'm just one person, I can't make a difference. Now I'm here to tell you, yes, you can. So this is two different examples. The one on the left is an organization I volunteer for. It's a big organization. We give away lots of t-shirts to our volunteers, and they were a blend of cotton and polyester. And I said, excuse me, can we get 100% cotton? So anyway, this is a picture in our 100% cotton shirts. On the right is my own case study. Anytime I taught a microplastics project, I made sure, this is an exception today, but I made sure that I was always wearing my university shirt that I just assumed was cotton because it felt like cotton. And one day I was like, let me actually look at the tag. And I looked and it was not. And I looked at my other work shirt and it was not. None of my work shirts were 100% cotton. They were all purchased before I got involved with this, just for a little footnote. So I said to my boss's boss, this is an issue. So I'm now proudly sporting my 100% cotton university shirt. So you can make a difference just by speaking up. And we do have a pledge that you can take. This is a statewide effort that we started as part of the Microplastic Awareness Project that gives you hints and tips and ideas, a lot of what I just alluded to, but you will actually like say, I'm gonna try and do this, or hey, I already do this. So I'll put that link in the chat at the end, but we've had thousands of pledges already done, and we've followed up with these people to see if they're actually making change, and they are. And that's what pledges are designed to do. So if you want to take that step today, I will give you that opportunity. We do also have a website as part of the Microplastic Awareness Project. It's a very easy URL. You can just go to plasticaware.org and it will redirect you to the site. If you want to learn more about the project, and there's tons of resources on the right-hand side, you can kind of scroll through the menu there. There's K through 12 resources if you're an educator. There's ways to get involved in the citizen science aspect if that piques your interest. If you are on Facebook, we have both a Facebook group and a Facebook page. The group is more where you will find updates on any relevant happenings as it relates to plastic or research, if you want to stay in touch that way. And this is just a screenshot of a hard copy of the pledge that I'm going to give you a link to, a virtual version of this. I do want to note there is another option if you see something that you do or want to try that's not on this list. We're not going to limit you. You can create your own action as well, and we might follow up with you too. So that's perfect. We have enough time for questions. My contact information, I'm going to leave this on the screen. We have a massive on-demand resource similar to Nature Knowledge, but on our YouTube channel as well. If you want to explore on Pinellas County Extension, we're on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and I'd be remiss if I did not say, I do have a podcast that releases episodes monthly on different natural resource topics. It's called Naturally Florida. So you can just, any of your podcast platforms, you can search for Naturally Florida and find us there. So I'm gonna open it up to Shelly to guide me in what's next.
Thank you, Lara. That was fantastic. You shared a lot of good information and some good things we can all do. So it wasn't all doom and gloom. So I appreciated that. So yeah, if anyone has questions, I mean, I feel like a lot of things were kind of answered as we went along, but this is the time if you have questions that weren't answered or questions that in your mind that you wanted to ask, please go ahead and put those in the chat now and we'll go through those. I'm trying to go back up to, I feel like a lot of these were asked and then you kind of answered them as you went along. One of the first questions I saw was asking about bioaccumulation, and I don't know if you talked a lot about that or if you had anything else to add on that. I mean, I know in animals, certainly non-human animals, but did you discuss a lot about anything about humans?
Yeah, I did not address that, but that is definitely part of the concern with kind of that slide where I showed the toxins and the animals ingesting, and definitely the bioaccumulation effect as organisms higher up in the food chain are eating these other organisms that already have toxins in them, and they have to eat a lot of them. So yes, there's definitely concern around that, which is part of the issue with what we're finding these. So what I didn't really say is products, the toxins that absorb to the plastic particles can then desorb into the animals. And the plastics themselves contain all sorts of chemicals and additives that give them different properties. Like a Ziploc bag is thin and flexible versus a plastic desk that is very hard and sturdy. And there's different additives and chemicals that they put in to make that possible. And so those themselves are also concerning. There's just so many different chemicals out there. So it's really hard to analyze it, but bioaccumulation is definitely, and biomagnification is a concern.
And you know, I think we can all imply the answer to this based on your presentation. But Susan asked, if we stop producing plastics and microplastics today, how will the residual microplastics in land and water continue to affect humans?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's usually like the number one thing people want to know is like, how is this impacting me? So yeah, I mean, if we were to stop, you know, it's still, we know it's already like out in the environment. We know that it's going to break down into microplastics. What we don't know is how that is impacting us ultimately. You know, there's been studies, it's been found in stool, it's been found in blood, it's in the air that we breathe. We know microplastics are in our body, but there aren't, it's again, it's so hard for us to say like, this is the result, you know, we're having this symptom as a result of ingestion of microplastics. It's incredibly challenging. There's not studies that have shown that. They're just more looking at modeling and the presence of microplastics. There's concerns as it relates to our gut microbiome, especially when we talk at the nanoparticle level. But again, we don't really have any like definitive answers yet in science. So we just always stress like the precautionary principle. Let's not wait till the science tells us like this is going to cause cancer or, you know, whatever it might be. And let's just try and get plastics out of our lives the best that we can. It's honestly like very, very, very hard to do.
So that's actually a good lead into this next question, which is, you know, what do we do with the plastics we already have in our homes now that we know they're maybe not the best thing?
Yeah, so, I mean, the key is keeping them out of the environment. So, you know, obviously reusing them as much as possible, like it's already been created. So let's use the product to its full capacity. And if it comes time for disposal, just ensure that you're disposing of it correctly. If there is an opportunity for it to be recycled, right? Obviously that's a great option. In our county, we have a waste to energy plant. So, because not all plastics can be recycled. And I do encourage you to do research on that because what we call wish cycling can actually do more harm than good. But so in some cases you can be like, oh, well, this is going to be turned into energy, if that makes you feel any better. So, and also what I do a lot of work with teachers. So if you have like a lot of plastic containers or something, like teachers always need stuff to do with students. So that could also be something you can consider, like making a donation so that it can be used time and time again for educational purposes.
Yeah, and one of the tidbits of a potential question of the day that I almost put up was actually what percent of plastic in the US is recycled, you know, plastic that's going to the landfill, what percent of that ends up in the recycling? It's only like 8% at most, I think, and that was a figure from a few years ago. So people, I think, a lot of times buy single-use plastic because they're like, oh, look, it's got the little recycling label on it, and it's may or may not actually be recycled. Even if you throw it in the bin, it doesn't mean it's going to get recycled necessarily.
Correct. Yeah, and you definitely have to do, because cities can be different from what your county is doing, and so you just definitely make sure that you ask your solid waste department, like, what are your rules for recycling, because it is going to vary county to county. There's no like statewide standard.
So there's been some good little discussion in the chat about, well, someone pointed out that you're wearing plastic glasses.
They're metal, but yeah, I mean, there's the frames are metal.
I'll defend you just saying, well, I mean, I think one of our biggest offenders are the single-use plastics, the easiest thing to switch in our lives. But people were suggesting bamboo and titanium products instead. Some people are asking about reusable grocery bags. You know, are those actually also recycled plastic?
Yeah, so yeah, there's many aspects. So again, I encourage people to like start small. with, you can't be like, oh, I'm going to get rid of all plastic like overnight. So like I started with the utensils and like straws. Reusable bags, they do make cotton tote bags. There are all natural alternatives to reusable bags. A lot of reusable bags are also made of plastic, and a lot of people do wash them for sanitary purposes, which I recommend. I will say that depending on how the textile is constructed or woven together, not all textiles shed microplastic particles at the same rate. Like fleece jackets were the #1 product studied because if you think about how they're designed, they're nice and soft and cozy because they're very loosely woven, which leads to a much higher rate of those fibers shedding. And like in the case of my glasses, like I love being called out. Like in the case of my glasses, like I hope to never, these will never hopefully like go, it's going to be something I use for a very, very long time. We want to really focus on the things that we do or use on a regular basis, like when we're washing our clothes, like I feel like I do every day with my daughter we're in potty training phase, so bear with me. But yeah, there's just different products that we're going to use a lot, and so those are the products we want to think about, like how can we limit plastics in those scenarios.
So Elizabeth asked a good question, and this probably doesn't have one answer, but she asked about the compostable single-use utensils. And I suspect there's a lot of different ones out there that are made of different things. So, but I don't know if those are any better. So that's kind of her question.
Yes, so that's another, they make it so challenging for consumers. So when you do see compostable utensils, typically it will have like a little asterisk or something, and it will say compostable in an industrial composting facility, which as far as I know, we don't really have. So it's not like if you have a backyard compost, you could throw it in there and it would become part of the compost. It needs like much higher levels of heat and things like that. So we just have to be cautious there because, if it's not going to a large industrial compostable facility, it's essentially going to be the same. It's really no different than the plastics. There's bioplastics as well, all different like corn-based plastics. And again, in order to kind of have that plastic durability or the things that we love about plastic, we're adding all sorts of different synthetic materials and additives. So while it might not be like true plastic, it's still again functioning and would have same causes for concern as a fully plastic product would. So it's really like, let's get back to like our, go to a thrift store and get an old set of silverware that you can just use and pack away in your bag. So you do have to be careful with alternatives, and there's a lot of greenwashing. You really have to do your homework as a consumer.
All right, so really quick, we still have at least 5 more minutes for questions, but I'm gonna launch a 3-question poll. So if everyone can just take 30 seconds and respond to that, that would be much appreciated. And then we can continue to answer questions as well. So someone actually, the next question was about medical waste, medical plastic waste. Do you know if there's any special initiatives specifically related to that or to deal with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I honestly don't know if there's any initiatives. I'd imagine the plastic lobbyists would win any shifts or changes related to that. Not to say nothing's happening, but I'm personally not aware of anything there. But it's a good question and a major source of especially the one-use plastic products.
We're kind of getting to the end of the list. There's just a lot of people throwing out comments about different things that they're doing, different products that they're using, glass straws, metal straws, different food containers. So
yeah,
I love all these suggestions. So
yeah, and I'll just throw out 2 more examples. So I have like a favorite Thai restaurant that I go to all the time, and of course they use styrofoam everything. And one day I said, if I just brought you some of my Pyrex containers, would you put the food in that instead of your stuff? And they said, sure. I said, okay. So again, it's like, just ask. And then I won't say the name of the brand, but I have a favorite spaghetti sauce that would, most spaghetti sauces are in glass jars. And this particular company, I went to go buy it and they had switched to a plastic jar. And I said, okay, well, you won't be getting my business anymore. And I wrote to the company because I was not happy. And, you know, I don't think it was just me that complained or like just me that made the difference, but they do now have, they're back to glass containers. So either enough people complained or I don't know what happened, but I like to say I contributed to that. So it just never hurts. And there's social media makes it so easy to find these companies and just go on Messenger and say, hey, I'm not happy because of this. So use your voice.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other actual questions. If anyone else has any questions, share them now.
I'm trying to scroll through too.
Yeah, or if I missed your question, post it again.
So yeah, and somebody mentioned that Florida has a law that bans banning plastic bags. So that is correct. There's a preemption against bans. There's lots of, you know, politics behind all that and reasons for that. What I have seen, I will say, as a result of that, at least locally, is that a lot of people are just going to voluntary efforts to just say like, hey, we're not going to do this. Like we actually have a local group that's working with hotels and restaurants, especially along our beachfront communities. And they're calling them, there's like ocean friendly businesses and there's different titles, but they're just trying to promote that they're green because they're not using these different products like plastic bags. So while there is a ban on banning, people are kind of approaching it through kind of the voluntary action end of it. So there, oh yeah, you tell me when to stop. I don't know.
We can go ahead and wrap it up. I mean, I
Okay.
appreciate everyone's comments on sharing their own approaches at home. It's so exciting to see everyone, people making their own little impact. So thanks everyone for sharing, and thank you, Lara. This was great. Everyone tune into Lara's other programs that she does. They're also wonderful. And oh, we need to share the Microplastics pledge link.
Oh, I'll put that in the chat right now.
Yeah. And so, oh, actually, I might have it here. Maybe it's not the one you're going to share, or the website. Oh, it's the same one. So yeah, everyone can go to that link and take the pledge. You can also go to the Florida Microplastics Awareness Project page and learn more information. But yeah, thank you for being here, and hope to see everyone in July for the next program. And with that, is there any final words you have for us?
I don't think so. I just appreciate the opportunity. And if you guys have additional questions like that I didn't get to, I'm happy to answer if you want to shoot me an email. I will say, ironically, our next podcast episode that we're going to launch is on microplastics as well. So if you want to recap, that should be launched in June, at the end of June.
All right. Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Bye.